Welcome back to Ignite&Scale. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Steve Young, Managing Director of ICDP. Steve has been at the forefront of European automotive retail analysis, leading ICDP's pan-European research efforts for many years. ICDP's work provides unique insight into the automotive market, focusing on agency models, the impact of electrification, and aftermarket strategies. This is particularly timely as we assess the motor retail landscape for 2025 and beyond. Steve, welcome to the show.
Hi Mike, it's thanks for the invitation and good to be with you.
No, you too. I mean, let's get straight into it really. I mean, perhaps on the agency model, this time last year, many were predicting a substantial shift towards agency models and direct-to-consumer sales. I mean, looking back, we haven't really seen that materialise, but I'm really interested in your perspective on how 2024 unfolded for agency models, not just in the UK, but also across Europe. And now that these changes have kind of materialised, how do you see the future shaping up for agency during 2025?
Well, I think there's a lot of misreporting of what's going on and a lot of naive expectations about what was going to happen. So there's a few points, but firstly, agency shouldn't be the objective. The objective is to give the consumer an omni-channel experience. And you can make an argument that agency, because it takes out finally all interbrand competition, price-based interbrand competition, would be the purest form of omni-channel. So you can make that argument, but it doesn't mean that you have to get to agency to make progress on omni-channel. So the target was wrong. The implementation plans that were laid out in many cases were poorly thought through, much too aggressive in terms of time frame, not well managed in terms of ensuring everything was in place, particularly around people and particularly around people in the manufacturers. And so we're not surprised that, putting it politely, many have stumbled. But the reality is that the momentum still, in terms of the number of brands who are pursuing agency as their chosen way of delivering omnichannel, is still in the majority. More are planning to do it or are doing it than those who are not. Now, have they achieved their objectives in terms of the overall, reducing the cost of distribution and things like that? Then I think not, because the practices are not properly sorted out on the manufacturer side. So they're doing things which they shouldn't be doing under agency, like pre-reg. The dealers are happy, generally, because the processes and systems have settled down and they can make money out of the pre-reg cars and ex-demo cars and so on. But we've got, it's a journey. It's not an overnight change. And I think we need to come back and look at it in 2 or 3 years' time. I believe the agency will be a significant feature of the landscape in that time frame.
Yeah. I mean, do you think it is just about adapting to a supply constraint to now back to a supply push market, and the agency plans will have to adapt to that really. They'll have to adapt the model. They're still committed to it, but they're just going to have to adapt to a more normalised pre-COVID market conditions we're seeing now in terms of supply.
That's an element of it, because I think quite a lot of the planning by some of the manufacturers took place in the post-pandemic period when you could sell anything at full price. And they were looking also at the Tesla model back, also broadly pre-pandemic, but more related to the fact there was no competition for Tesla. And they had fixed prices, and that was that. And so their reference points were wrong. We know that the industry has overcapacity. We know nobody wants to cut back on production because they believe someone else will fill the gap. and that's the reality of life. But they should have planned for that reality because that was known. The zero interest rates. We knew that was a blip. We knew at some point they'd go back up again, but they don't seem to have thought about that through. So it all comes down to poor planning in terms of those who've come off the rails, like Ford, for example.
Yeah, interesting. And maybe just moving on to electrification. I mean, whether people like it or not, electrification is accelerating. And I think I recall from your summer conference data, many expected a shift in aftermarket and after sales strategy, particularly due to the initial lower maintenance needs for EVs. How did you actually see this play out in 2024? And what do you think the dynamic will be in 2025 in the after sales market to reflect these changes?
Well, one of the characteristics of the aftermarket, which we all appreciate, is that it's relatively stable because it's driven by the park and scheduled service requirements and miles or kilometers driven, and so it doesn't move that quickly, and that's why people like it, because it's effectively an annuity type business that underpins the dealer model and underpins the manufacturers and in terms of part sales. So we're not going to see dramatic shifts from one year to the next, from 24 to 25 or even 26. It's a slow burn. We actually run our projections on EV impact on the aftermarket out to 2040, because even looking out to 2030 or 2035, you've still got a lot of ICE cars sitting in the park. Now, it obviously affects the franchise dealers earlier because they're more focused on the 3 to 5 year old park, and so relatively quickly they'll be getting a higher mix of BEVs compared to the independents. But at the moment, the service intervals for most manufacturers, Tesla being the notable exception, are still broadly in line with ICE cars, so it's annual or every 2 years. And there's been a lot of recall and warranty work on the BEVs that have kept workshops full, even if it's not full with the type of work that the dealers would like to have. So the impact has been relatively modest. Even Norway, which is now, heading towards the full 100% EV only sales next year, and it's currently over 70% sort of penetration. Their workshops haven't really seen an effect because of the amount of warranty and repair work and the legacy ICE park. So that it will have an effect, but it will take time for that to work through.
No, that's fascinating. And I guess from what I've seen in your research, it shows that European consumers are more interested in EVs, but there's still concerns over charging infrastructure and the cost of the vehicles. I mean, when we look at 2024, do you think that some of these concerns still slowed the actual consumer demand adoption of EVs? And do you think this will improve in 2025? I guess it does depend on the extent to which OEMs stimulate the market, but I'd be really interested in your views on kind of private demand on EVs and how you see that at the moment and how you see it develop.
Well, it varies. It varies widely across Europe. If you look at South or Eastern Europe compared to the North, including the UK. But the general picture is that there are still consumer concerns about the cost, about residual values, about range, charging infrastructure. Still, people thinking that batteries are short-lived and likely to go up in flames. So those are sort of general comments that we picked up in some focus groups that we did just a couple of months ago. And so there's lots of reasons for the consumer, the retail buyer, to be nervous, and incentives in general have been reduced or eliminated. Again, there's a few exceptions, but most of the tax or most of the incentives are actually focused on business users, and that's why clearly you get this distortion that the business users still want to buy BEVs, but the retail customers don't. And we're not going to get high penetration, let alone 100% transition to BEVs by 2030, as long as these barriers still exist. Some of them real, but some of them also perceptions that need to be addressed and need to be addressed by the industry, by dealers in terms of communication and so on. And government needs to stop sending out mixed messages, which has been a significant issue. Not just here, but again, in Germany. Germany removed all the incentives. It's like 2 weeks' notice in December last year. The market just collapsed totally overnight.
Yeah, so it feels like even in 2025 and, on the current status quo, consumers will still remain unsure about EVs for good reason.
Yeah, and I think even people close to the industry don't understand what's going on. I mean, politicians I don't have a high expectation of, but I participated in a webinar or observed a webinar recently, and the host and sponsor of the event was talking about how well the sales of EVs were going, because we're heading towards a situation where the ZEV mandate targets will largely be met for this year. But we all know within the industry, or you'd like to think people would know within the industry, that's a huge cost, to the manufacturers in particular and the dealers to some extent. The cost of getting there is massive. And just because you end up hitting the magic numbers does not mean that there is a demand. But I fear that it will actually be used against the industry, not just in the UK, but also in continental Europe with the European Commission, because they'll say, well, you managed it last year, so what's the problem? The fact it's cost billions to get there, and all sorts of issues around the pre-registration of EVs and them coming out onto the used market and so on with huge discounts in order to make them sellable. All these factors will just be ignored. So, well, you did it. You're just crying wolf.
No, I think you're right, and I've seen lots of examples like that on social media as well, where the SMMT data comes out, and then obviously proponents of people that enjoy EVs say, "Look, we're winning the war. Look at the BEVs kind of coming through." But as you say, they're not considering the cost or where the actual cars are going. In terms of they're just looking at volume, which, as we know, is a small part of the equation normally in terms of profitability.
Absolutely, and you could make an argument probably that the manufacturers would have been better um, letting the natural forces work through in the UK this year, missed their targets, cost them millions and billions in fines, but then be able to then have a meaningful conversation with government in the UK, but also with the Commission in Europe, saying, look, the consumer demands are not there. You're pushing this ahead of consumer demand. At the moment, it looks like it's all balanced.
I'd love to do the maths on that. And I mean, finally, Steve, as we look into 2025, what do you see as the key challenges facing dealerships and OEMs? I know we've touched on a couple, but really focus on the key ones in order of priority. And do you think we'll see dealerships close, rooftops capacity being cut, and can strategies like competition, new service models help dealers thrive in this changing market? I'd love your insights on that.
I think that the manufacturers understand that networks are more dense than they need to be if you look at it purely in terms of customer drive times. We've done modeling with urban science that shows that you can have the number of typical dealers and it makes barely any difference to the average drive time or the coverage. But the reality is that they're very nervous about leaving a particular town to the competition, even if there's another dealer, 20 minutes away. And the new entrants have, Chinese brands have come in with ambitions to build broadly comparable networks. So whilst the theory says that you could dramatically cut the number of franchise points, experience says that it's not going to happen sort of anytime soon. There's a need to cut distribution cost, and franchise cost is an element of that, but it's not the biggest element. The biggest element is actually all the discounts and financial support, subvention and so on. That's half the cost of distribution or more. But do we need to have great big gin palaces? No, we don't. Our consumer research says that it doesn't particularly influence the buying decision. The buying decision is based mainly on the people. So we need better quality people. We don't need better quality facilities. And that legacy cost is there. You can do an exercise to say, oh, we're reduced to standards, or we're under agency where we don't need to have all these things, so we're only paying X of the facility cost. But the legacy cost is still there, and that's where you end up with the nonsense that we have with leasing home, Mercedes Stockport, for example, great big massive 50, 60 million pound investment, which has now got BYD in it. And I dare say there'll be one or two other brands added in there as well in due course. The Mercedes star on the roof. So it's not something that will change overnight, but I do think that we will see more multi-branding. I think that there will be a reduction in investors, definitely. That will bring with it, to some extent, a reduction in the number of sites. And that will create some opportunities in the after-sales space, because you'll end up with gaps in the coverage. And the challenge for the manufacturers is, how do you cover that? Because there's a good probability that you'll lose that business to the independents as soon as you close the site. You presented them with a trigger where they have to make a choice. And when they make a choice, they'll look at it with a clean sheet of paper. They won't automatically say, oh, well, I'll go to my next closest franchise.
It's fascinating, and I think obviously 2024 has been tough for dealers, and 2025 doesn't look like it will change. But the complexity of the market and the nuances will be there, as we love to analyse. But Steve, it's been a great pleasure sharing some of your insights, and I'll ensure your contact details, etc., will be in the show notes as well, because I'm a avid reader of your research and your events and the podcasts that you do. So it's it's always good to hear your insight into the market. So thank you.
No, that's a pleasure, Mike. Always happy to chat.
Great, thank you.
If you want to listen to more episodes of the podcast, we're on all good audio platforms. Our website is also www.cambriaprivatecapital.com, and you can also find myself on LinkedIn and Twitter, where we publish our weekly blogs as well. Please do get in touch if you want more information.